We often see disabilities show up in history in these moments where it's used as this propaganda to vilify people. And that's one of the tricks of disability history of like it shows up in a lot of places of negative instances, not positive instances.
Welcome to The Wheelchair Activist, a podcast hosted by me, Emma Vogelman, and every month I interview amazing members and allies of the disabled community who are quite literally changing the world. Well, Dan, a huge welcome to the Wheelchair Activist podcast. Could you tell my lovely listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Dan Howlett. I just graduated with my PhD in history from George Mason University, where my dissertation focused on early American disability and religion, especially during the Salem Witchcraft Trials. And I've been working on this since I was in high school. I did a history project on the witch trials for National History Day, and then just never stopped. So when I was an undergrad, I learned about disability history and thought, wow, no one has looked at Salem through this lens and kept with it. And hopefully, eventually, there'll be a book out about it.
And for anyone who doesn't know this about me, and Dan, you won't necessarily, but I have always found sort of like witchy things super interesting. I mean, the whole like, movies and all of that, Sabrina the Teenage Witch and all of its guises. But I find the witch trials so incredibly interesting when you really learn about them. And I think from my perspective, I've learned about them from a very feminist perspective and learning about women who were persecuted for essentially no reason. But I think a lot of people, and this is myself included, weren't aware of just how much disabled women were impacted during these. So that is what we are here to talk about today in honor of this going out in October. So hopefully it is satisfying a spooky itch that some people have. But I would really love it if you could tell our listeners a little bit of a rundown of how disabled women fit into the Salem witch trials.
Witchcraft is very much a crime of the body in a lot of these cases. The devil grants supernatural powers that can enhance your body and give you things like supernatural strength. We get testimony from Tituba saying how Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, who are not in the best physical condition according to descriptions of them, are carrying her around and forcing her to go places. They describe Osborne as melancholy and bedridden. Sarah Good is in her 30s and she's pregnant, so this is not their peak physical moment. They have other things on their minds for their bodies, but the devil is granting them these different abilities. And we see that with men too. George Burroughs gets this supernatural strength where he allegedly lifts up a barrel of molasses, he lifts a musket with just his fingers. So they're trying to create this image of the supernatural body and the physical body as having these complete differences and hold whatever physical difference against the suspect.
And how did you get into this as an area of study?
So my ancestors sort of caused the witchcraft trials.
This just
Cousin
got interesting. Carry on.
cousin Ann Putnam Jr. accused about 80 people of witchcraft. So most of the witchcraft trials are family ties to me through marriage or some way. I'm descended from the Putnams, John and Rebecca Putnam defended Rebecca Nurse, so not all bad. They did testify against George Burroughs, who was executed. My 10th great grandmother, Mary Bradbury, was convicted and escaped. Going through a different line, it also looks like I'm tied to the doctor who diagnosed the witchcraft afflictions. So really, like everyone in the witch trials is a family connection.
Wow.
Yeah, so I looked into the family history for that high school project and then just was like, oh, this is really cool as a
Hmm.
subject. Having a personal tie to it kept me engaged, and it just never stopped.
And what about it particularly interests you? I mean, you've got the family connection, but like how does it feel, I suppose, knowing that your ancestors were sounds a little bit on both sides, but mostly maybe on the accusing side. Yeah, how has that sort of felt for you as you've been doing this research?
I very much pitched this as my family were the villains in the witch trials. They led to a lot of accusations. The Putnam family were the most prolific accusers during this. And that really keeps my interest of just like how did they get to that point and understanding it. I very much take the view that history can have a social justice bend to it. So looking at the past and looking at what my ancestors did and thinking about the world we're in today, where witch hunting comes up a fair amount. Since 2017, lots of people have asked me, "Hey Dan, how do you feel about the term witch hunt being thrown around by figures such as the president?" I have many thoughts, and like having had my family on one side of a witch hunt, let's not do that again.
Yeah, I mean, well, we can absolutely get into how it's sort of manifesting in today because I think it's scary in a lot of ways. I think a lot of things that are happening in the US in this administration do a very eerie reminders, hints, symbols, etc., of various eras in history. I absolutely don't need to tell you that as the
Yep.
historian, but so you find out that you've got this family connection. What about disability sort of drew you to it? Because a lot of people, I think, are really surprised to find out exactly what you said, that like physical abnormalities, for, lack of a better expression, were quite often considered to be like links or signs of the devil. But where did that sort of specific interest come from for you?
I took a class in undergrad and we talked about disability history in the Second Great Awakening, which Sari Altschuler's fantastic work on deafness during that religious movement. And I thought about how the afflicted girls who were making these accusations were suffering from being blind, mute, or deaf, and they treat this as suffering. And I was thinking about like, okay, so there's a disability narrative here of like how these symptoms are being used to make accusations. So I just started looking at how the afflictions worked as disability and where sensory disability really comes in a lot of places. And that led me to thinking about other ways disability shows up, and it's very much the accusers use disability to make accusations and give themselves credibility. They say, oh, I can't see, I can't hear, so they can only provide so much testimony until the specter of a witch stops them. And then whenever they're accusing someone, it's not necessarily disability status that causes the accusation. Gender, local politics, family grudges are very much at the forefront of why they accuse someone. But wherever it's possible, they can just say, oh, maybe this person's body is a sign of something else too. And they add that narrative where possible. It's not in every case. It's not the main impetus for an accusation. But when Rebecca Nurse is accused and she doesn't hear questions that the judges are asking, they start saying, oh, that's the devil whispering in her ear. Her disability is proof that she's working with Satan. So there's two different narratives here. The accusers using it to make accusations and then affirming guilt with disability.
So really, it can be weaponized by either side. Is that sort of how you would interpret that?
I would say this is kind of both sides using it and weaponizing it against the suspects who are
Mm.
arrested. And then what ends up happening, and I think this is really fascinating, is that cognitive disability becomes a defense that a lot of people end up using. So the confessors in mostly the town of Andover, which is now North Andover, where I grew up, that's where more people were accused than anywhere else. It's also where a lot of people confess to witchcraft. And this is because most people realize people who are confessing are being used as witnesses and they're staying in jail and being held for future trial. People who are claiming innocence are going to trial and being executed. So this is buying time. It's not a get out of jail free card. If the trials went on indefinitely, they probably would have been executed too. It just happens Salem ends before any confessors are executed. But then they have to start recanting. And when they recant, they say, oh, I was temporarily out of my senses. They were frightened out of it. And we get this interesting tie of emotion and disability and how cognitive ability changes with this emotional state. The fear of these accusers, the intimidation of the courtroom causes them to just temporarily lose their rational senses. So they turn disability into something else that the accusers aren't using and it's then this physical and sensory disability on one side versus this cognitive disability on the other, both using it for their own needs.
I mean, it's incredibly fascinating in so many perspectives, but I'm thinking, I know from, so my background, I did a law degree, what feels like a very long time ago. Specifically, I did UK law. I grew up stateside, but now live in the UK. But one thing, that one defense that we didn't cover because it was no longer usable was sort of, I don't know if it was called necessarily temporary madness, but it's essentially like in the heat of the moment, like you were saying, like temporary loss of my ability of like sense and reason. And they stopped using it because it felt very, how do you possibly prove that? How do you justify that? How do you, I think there are of course moments where we all could look back and go, why did I do that? But to use it in sort of a criminal defense, I think is very, very different. But I'd love if there were any stories that you could share specifically about disabled women, sort of on any sides of the equation. I know you mentioned a couple already, but I think it's really interesting how sometimes disability is being used as a defense, and other times it's being used as confirmation of a crime, that crime being witchcraft.
Yeah, so Elizabeth Johnson Jr. is a great example. She was the most recent to be exonerated from her conviction in 2022. So like this has gone on for a very long time
My
that there's just no
gosh.
record on the books of her being exonerated. She was a teenager, her mother had been accused, and her grandfather, Francis Dane of Andover, writes a petition in January of 1693 when the trials are winding down, and he's trying to explain her confession. He says that she's at best simplish and tries to explain that she maybe just doesn't know enough, and she took the common talk of the town and confessed mistakenly because she just did not have the cognitive mindset to like, understand what was happening. So we don't know what like her mind is simplish at best means. Whenever we talk about disability history, we don't want to diagnose something. We should take the terms that they use and like understand them in that context as like a variable of human experience and not try to figure out what that means. They just refer to her mental state as something else. And they're clearly using it in a way of like she does not have the same abilities as other people to understand the courtroom dynamics, and she confesses thinking it's what she's supposed to do, that she's been urged on by people in jail, by her family members. There's other ways to look at this narrative too, of like maybe people pushed her to confess because her mother's in jail, parents don't want to take care of children outside of jail. Like when I look at the case of Dorothy Good, who's 4 years old, her mother, Sarah Good, had been arrested. Dorothy Good goes and she gets arrested. I'm gonna take a guess
And
that her father was okay with this because he was then the one taking care of the child at home. Dorothy
was
then goes
she
to jail.
was she arrested at 4 years old?
Yes. Dorothy
What could
Good is
she
4 years
possibly
old.
have done?
So her mother, Sarah Good, is one of the first few arrested and is the likely suspect. Dorothy gets accused and confesses because you have a 4 year old, you take her to the judges, like you can get her to say anything. My suspicion is her father, William, isn't a fan of having the childcare duties while his wife is in jail. And William testified against Sarah too at her examination, saying that he feared she might be an enemy to all good. So, like, the marriages at this time, there are husbands and wives accusing each other. Dorothy, though, is 4 years old. She's in jail for months, probably about a year, I think. Jails are flooding, they're overcrowded, there's disease. This is going to have a traumatic effect on her. We
Yeah.
don't know much of what happens to her afterwards, but she is put under guardianship because she is not able to take care of herself. So there is a narrative of some sort of cognitive disability in her life that we just know she's passed around to different guardians. There's not too much to trace her other than the offhand of like who gets the payment from the town for taking care of her.
Do we know why she was arrested? Was it purely because her mother was, well, I'm assuming she was accused of and convicted of witchcraft?
So her mother had been arrested at this point. the trials hadn't started, but witchcraft is a family thing. If a mother is accused, her daughters tend to get accused as well. Sometimes husbands and spouses will get accused afterwards too. This is very much like different families feuding with each other and accusing families, and that just allows for the expansion of accusations, especially where there are family members who express their thoughts on the accusations and are maybe not a big fan of their family member being accused and arrested. Like Rebecca Nurse was arrested and examined. Her sisters, Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce, have petitions going around to release Rebecca and prove she's not a witch. They both get accused as well. And it's in those acts of protest that accusations start following too. So Dorothy Good, there's not a stated reason as to why she's next after her mother, but it is a family connection and it's an easy one to make.
And did her mother, do we know if there was any disability connection in terms of Sarah?
We don't know. She's in her 30s and pregnant at the time of her accusation, so physical status, it's not disability, like pregnancy status is very different,
Yeah.
but they are talking about bodily difference. And if you're in your 30s and pregnant, that's a different experience than most women in their 20s and pregnant at this time. So they do have different narratives of like what state a person's body is in. And she's one of the women that is given this great strength to carry Tituba around to other places. So it's not too much in Sarah's case that disability is a main factor, but they do highlight this difference of like she's pulling Tituba around when she's someone who gives birth in jail.
That's so interesting. So the fact that she was simply able to have a child outside of the standard ages that women, like you said, at that time were having children, that physical difference was enough to place a woman under suspicion.
It's not strictly that she's a beggar as well, so she was going around begging for money too, so she's disliked for
Mm.
it. But people's bodies show up in the accusations. They are going to reference people's bodies in different ways. And like the body and witchcraft is so tied together that wherever it can get implied that something's up with their body, it's coming into the accusations, it's coming into evidence.
Did this ever happen to men? Because you mentioned, like men or, maybe there were other men who were accused of sort of, I don't, was it called witchcraft? If it was a man, but
Yeah.
am I right that men were also being accused at this time?
Yeah, plenty of men are also accused. Here, which is a gender neutral term, really, it means that you made a covenant with the devil. So it's not the same way we think of witches and warlocks. There are different levels. So sometimes a male witch might be a conjurer just because they're a little bit higher up with different statuses. There's a ton of different terms that they use, but witch is the common one. Men are accused as well, and their bodies become central to these accusations too. George Jacobs Sr. is one of the older victims. He's about 80 years old, and he walked with two canes. We know he had some type of arthritis. And what happens when he's accused is the specter would go off and cause harm. So the physical person would stay one place, and the specter that the devil grants this power to send off your supernatural form goes and does the actual afflicting during witchcraft. George Jacobs' specter travels with his canes. Most other specters aren't bringing props with them, but he's taking his canes and he's beating them spectrally. He's beating the girl spectrally with these canes, and they highlight that. They mention, "Oh, I see the man with his two staffs, and he's hurting me with them. He's beating them." So his physical disability is just symbolic of who he is as a person when they're making the accusations. And his tools for accessibility in the world, his two canes, are the weapons he's using.
That's fascinating. So this poor man could be, or anyone, could literally be in a place where there are witnesses. They could be with other people, but if this specter is going off and doing their bidding, then it seems like it doesn't actually matter.
Yeah, the idea is that the devil gives you this supernatural ability to send your specter out, and only the accusing girls, also accusing men and women too, it's not just young girls, it's just mostly young girls, can see the specter. And they'll be in the courtroom acting as if the specter's actually there causing harm and hurting them. No one else can see it. The judges can't see it. The sheriff can't see it. They treat it as real. These mostly young girls are acting out. They're saying the specter is hurting them. They take this as eyewitness testimony because only the devil can grant someone to have that power to send out a specter.
What benefit in society at that time would someone making an accusation receive? Like, what was there any benefit? Were they considered to be purer? Or I'm just thinking, why would someone choose to make that up about another person? Like, yeah, it could be for revenge or it could be a general dislike, but I'm thinking, was there an incentive at all?
Part of this incentive is if you make accusations, you avoid being accused. So we start to see accusations pick
Mhm.
up from new people when they realize they might be under suspicion if they don't get on the train and start going. We see this move through different towns at different times. So Salem is kind of the first wave, and then Andover picks it up. Lots of people realize that they can do it too. So family grudges start coming out, and there's different alliances. There's political ties between some of the families that make accusations against other families. There's no personal incentive, like no one gains money from the accusation itself. That tends to be one of the claims that I see go around that's not actually correct. No one gets the land of the people that they accuse. There are people profiting. The sheriff gets to loot property of people who are accused and don't pay their jail fees. So he's basically collecting debts from them and probably stealing more than he's supposed to. Philip English basically
Mm.
refers to the fact that his entire home is looted and all his movable goods are basically gone because the sheriff's allowed to take, and he doesn't really count correctly.
Wow, okay. So it really does feel then it's for self-preservation, but then also weaponized later to make these accusations. But I'm interested how this started, or at least from your research, sort of where these witch trials started. I mean, obviously, religion and the beliefs of sort of good and evil, God and the devil, those ideas and those concepts have been around for an extremely long time. But how did the witch trials start?
Yeah, so the first accusations are against Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. This is a group of young girls making accusations against the easy target. Sarah Good, a beggar. Sarah Osborne has had a scandal in her past. She's had some recent legal troubles with the Putnam family who are making accusations. And Tituba is an enslaved woman in the home where these accusations start. So they're starting with the easy targets. And the reason it's coming out in 1692 is that there's several different tensions going on. One of the main ones is Reverend Samuel Parris is the minister at the time. He's not well liked by a good portion of the town. There's been conflict over whether Salem Village should become its own independent town versus Salem Town keeping it. Parris is the minister in Salem Village. He and his supporters want to be their own community. The committee that pays the minister is taken over by the other faction that's not in support of this, and they stopped paying Paris a few months earlier. This is a tactic that the Putnams had also used against George Burroughs when he was the minister in the 1680s. So there's back and forth local town factional politics going on. It's in Paris's home that his daughter and niece are the first to suffer witchcraft afflictions. And it's likely that the parents are the ones who suggest the names, whether or not Samuel Paris or Thomas Putnam say, "Hey, who's the witch? Is it Sarah Good?" These are small houses. Parents are up late, they're talking, they're gossiping. You overhear mom and dad say, "Oh, that Martha Corey, I can't believe her." The kids know what name they want when they're asked who is the witch. The parents are the ones who say, "Who is the witch afflicting you?" And the girls provide names. And the parents probably support the names that they want to hear. They give good feedback. There's also moments where if the girls become afflicted with witchcraft, suddenly, oh, they don't have to do their chores anymore. They're distracted with something else. They can stop. There's one document where a minister refers to seeing mother speak to her child as like a disciplinary tone, and the girl starts being afflicted with witchcraft symptoms, and suddenly like, oh, things change. So the girls know what they're doing when these symptoms break out, but they're reacting to what the parents want with these local political divisions in the background. There's also this larger narrative of indigenous violence creeping in on them. Indigenous people are resisting English colonization. There's a lot of violence on the main frontier. There's a lot of attacks going on up there. A lot of people in the Salem area have survived an attack or they know someone who has, and they're worried that Salem is next. This is still like all frontier towns for the most part. Like there are some places where there's a mile between your house and your neighbor's house, so people are just terrified that indigenous people are going to come and attack them anytime. So there's this whole like very racist narrative behind the witch trials too of Satan and the Indians are planning to destroy this English Puritan colony. And we get a lot of testimony related to that language too. George Burroughs, having survived two major raids in Maine, makes it a little suspicious of how could he survive both of these major attacks where Mercy Lewis, one of his accusers, lost a lot of family in one of them. So we see lots of different motivations come out. There's some idea of maybe there's like post-traumatic stress disorder happening among some of these accusers just because like these are horrific events. This is frontier violence and warfare going on. Whatever happens, especially to these children, is probably traumatic as far as what they can remember. And like some of them probably have seen family members die or know close family members who died. That doesn't excuse what they do with making accusations. But we see a lot of different dynamics at play that build up, and Salem is really the straw breaking on the camel's back.
That's so interesting. But I think it's a narrative and all of that context that you just gave is very rarely or if at all covered. I talk a lot on this podcast about how mainstream media, portrays disability, and sometimes it is in a way that allows for a meaningful insight to happen, and then there are ways that are just downright offensive or they're wrong or all of those really negative things. But I'm thinking about the witch trials and thinking about all of the content that I've seen, which is obviously only a fraction of what there is out there. None of that context is covered in terms of the stories that we see.
Yeah, so I've worked as a tour guide in Salem before. I've heard many tourists come up and say things, we'll put it nicely as they just say some things where
Give me an example. Just give me one example.
well we'll go with the one that I most like to correct, which is the ergot poisoning theory. I'm guessing you've seen something about the wheat or the rye.
A little bit, but tell me.
So in the 1970s, there was this idea that came out that there was ergot fungus growing on the rye, and they consumed this fungus, and it caused hallucinations. And there was just mass ergotism that causes the witchcraft trials because it causes these hallucinations. They see these specters. Ergotism also includes other symptoms like vomiting, livid skin. It's not what happens. It's not what
Okay.
happens in 1692. That narrative gets thrown around a lot because I think it's an easy explanation. It's really easy to say, oh, we wouldn't do that today because we don't eat fungus. Well, they also would have looked at their rye when they're collecting it in the field and have gone, gross. This is a fungus. And they wouldn't have eaten it. There's other flaws too, like you need to have a vitamin A deficiency for erotism to really take effect. And where Salem is located with a lot of access to fish and dairy, they would have been fine. It's also within different households. So some siblings get these witchcraft afflictions, others don't. Erotism is not going to select family members, and only this 12-year-old in this house gets it, and then only this 10-year-old in this other house gets it. Like it's gonna either have to be all or
Hmm.
none.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense of it being suspicious. But I think, what you were saying, like, I think there's something really interesting in that of using sort of medicinal, chemical, or medical reasons to try and explain why that happened. And like you said, why it in theory wouldn't happen now. But from what you were describing about, the grudges or the perceptions of people and therefore like the rhetoric that gets thrown around, that very much happens now.
Yeah. Salem happens again and again and again. And this is the point I try to make in my classes when I give talks, that this is not a one-off instance. In 1741, there's the New York conspiracy trials, which is very much not known about. It's a very cool series of trials where more deaths happen. It's a fascinating story. It is one of the most tragic events in colonial America. Lots of enslaved people are executed with burnings here. They don't burn in Salem. They do burn some people in New York for this. They hang a number of people and they banish about 200 enslaved people to the Caribbean, where like slavery is more brutal and like that's basically a death sentence too. All of that is based on this idea that there was a conspiracy to destroy the white population of New York, where enslaved
Oh,
people are plotting.
goodness.
Yeah.
Here we
They
go.
say they're plotting, they're causing fires because there were a series of fires. This is a wooden city, it's a port city. There are tons of taverns, there are drunk sailors everywhere. That's what's happening. Like fires happen, but they start blaming enslaved people because there are just so many fires, and they start saying, "Oh, I saw this enslaved person running away from the start of this fire." And they get some confessions because there were a few people who were arrested for a robbery who then tell this narrative of, oh, here's this other plot going on. And they find white conspirators, which is what terrifies them, that John Hewson, a white tavern owner, could possibly be involved. And they get a letter from a man in Plymouth. It's sent anonymously to one of the governor's council members who says, hey, what you're doing reminds us up here in Massachusetts a lot of the Salem witchcraft trials, and we realized that this was bad. We recommend you stop too. That's essentially what happens
Well,
as it's kind of winding down. But within 50 years, they're making that same comparison to Salem of like this set of trials based on nonsense evidence and convicting and killing people. Within 50 years, Salem becomes the reference point.
and that would, I mean, less so than sort of in today's lifespans, but I mean, that would have been within living memory of people in Salem going, this happened to maybe my parent or, whatever generation it might be, and being able to make that direct comparison is incredibly important. But I'm interested in the second group of trials that you mentioned. It sort of is seeming like there needs to be a marginalized community that is to blame for whatever the problems are that the society is experiencing. But in that second group of trials, you mentioned enslaved people. Do you know if disability played much of a role in those trials?
This is an area of research that I'm moving towards. I'm very much curious about finding continuity between these different sets of trials. While they're separate events and different historical actors involved, there's similar themes of bodies in them. So they do mention like they see this enslaved person who jumps over three fences. So they're again granting this supernatural ability to someone who is other. So far, I haven't looked at it too much to tell like there's a huge disability angle to it, but they are playing with ideas of ability and at least some of this testimony. So it's an area of research that I'm moving towards as like maybe part two of my book.
Well, then we will have to have you back for part two. But I'm so interested though, because like as you've been talking, it sounds like disability or this otherness body wise, because I'm thinking the jumping over three fences, like that to me is almost opposite of disability. So it's kind of like the opposite of the old man with the two canes, but it's sort of like you have this positive, like supernatural or superhuman ability. So even like being physically fit or well or capable still doesn't protect you.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to put into my book project is that they'll reference George Jacobs' two canes, and that's to insinuate a little bit of why might he sign up with the devil? Because he wants to get this great strength. So they'll use
Mm.
any sort of difference that's against their idea of what a normal body should look like. And it's all these different comparisons, and they'll use it in whatever way they can of having like the normal body and any deviation that they can use because it's very much a fluid and flexible line that the judges, the ministers get to set, and they move that line constantly. So bodies are always under scrutiny. What makes up the body that is acceptable at the time constantly changes, and they're willing to overlook contradictions in what they're saying. They are not always the most consistent, and they kind of know it, but they can make all these justifications because you'll have ministers who grow to an old age and they'll have their disability that comes on through age. Well, God has granted them a long life. They have lived such a great and devout life. God has allowed them to age into disability. Whereas Rebecca Nurse can't hear a question. That's the devil whispering in her ear. She's a 70-year-old woman who describes herself as being hard of hearing. Those are two different sides of
Wow.
the same coin. Yeah.
That's wild to me. I mean, I wish that was more surprising. I mean, the feminist in me screaming, like, it's because he's a man in a position of authority that, he's almost being blessed with, this abnormally long life, for that time. And I'm saying that, and I can't help but to think about Gollum from Lord of the Rings. Sort of like, the power of the ring granted him this abnormally, like, unnaturally long life. But like you said, then this woman who is hearing impaired or, an age-related impairment, and you're right, she's being villainized for it. I just think that it's fascinating. It's so interesting because I mean, again, this is with a 2025 perspective where being able to speak truth to power is obviously much, much different to how it would have been then. But just this thought of why is society accepting these, like you said, these really blatant contradictions in logic and in reasoning from these power holders. Like, do you think people went along with it out of a place of fear, out of a place of necessity? Like, where do you think that buy-in and just sort of like, well, he said it, so that's what we're going to believe now came in?
Yeah. The feminist angle is a huge part of this. Like, it's hard to separate the witchcraft trials from gender in any way. Like, I do lots of history on the internet. So, I've been on Reddit for Ask Historians where I'm a moderator and I'll write my answers on the Salem Witch Trials there.
I will include a link to that in the description of this episode because I'm a big Reddit fan and hopefully other people will too.
Yeah. So on Ask Historians, I will answer all the Salem Witch Trial questions. And in this last year, I've gone two different times someone saying that the witch trials can't be that much about gender and like arguing with me about how gender isn't truly part of this,
Oh, for
which is a
God's
bizarre
sake.
take. It's
Yeah.
bizarre. Like, there's no way you can argue that. But like on these ideas of contradiction, for a lot of these people in Puritan New England, their experiment needs to work. They established in 1630 Boston as the city on a hill, and it is the Puritan kingdom to be the example to prove to everyone else that they are correct in trying to purify the Church of England of all these Catholic rites. It needs to work for them because they have placed all their bets on this. So Massachusetts as a Puritan colony is truly something that they depend on succeeding, and they see enemies everywhere. The devil and witches, indigenous people are coming for them and they have to prove themselves. And part of that is these internal threats. So actually, the other day I was lecturing in class on early Massachusetts history and talking about dissenters. And we see like Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer, who are famous dissenters from Massachusetts Puritan state or colony. Hutchinson gets banished. She goes and hangs out with Roger Williams in Rhode Island. Dyer is also banished. She comes back and she's eventually executed for being a Quaker and refusing to obey her banishment. Both these women have narratives of monstrous births told about them. And we looked at in my class the narrative of Dyer's monstrous birth, and they say that she gives birth to an infant who has all these different deformities, horns, there are two mells on the back, various descriptions. It's fairly extensive, just how much they describe this monstrosity, as they call it. Even like their limbs were like fowls with talons on them. Like,
What?
so what's probably happening here is that she had a miscarriage or stillbirth of a child with birth defects or deformities, and they make this incredibly horrific narrative of here's this monster she gave birth to, because they expect this is what a body should look like when it is born. If it doesn't look like that, this is some sort of divine judgment. And they do this for these two dissenters, and the main argument there is theologically they have dissented from our Puritan colony. Then God is punishing them by not letting them have their reproductive system work effectively and properly. So their own bodies are physically showing and creating what comes from their theology. It is dissent, and their bodies will not create a human life from it. God is punishing them with these moments. And this is probably one of the worst moments of their lives, that they have a child who dies. At the time, having a child with disability probably would have also been something that horrified them because they would perceive that as judgment too, whether or not the child survived. But this is an awful moment. And we tend to see disability come in these moments of people's lives where it's only in those awful moments we get a glimpse of it because of how they treat disability. It's in this stillbirth that we see Mary Dyer have like this meta narrative how truly terrible she was for the colony because they couldn't bear to have a Quaker there. Like, this is a horrible thing to have happen to her. It's horrible to say these things about her when this is something that she probably like had a child. Like, it's different for like maternal affection at this time. It's not the same as what we think of. Still, she was going to have a child and it dies on her. That is awful for her, and it's used against her because they need this Puritan experiment to work. They're going to root out dissent and blame anything they can on dissent. So we often see disabilities show up in history in these moments where it's used as this propaganda to vilify people. And that's one of the tricks of disability history of like it shows up in a lot of places of negative instances, not positive instances.
I mean, for the people who are watching this as opposed to listening to it, you'll have seen my facial reaction throughout all of that just be like it mixed, like horrified. And because you're absolutely right, like that would have been potentially the worst moment in that woman's life. And then it's being used against her. But I think it's so interesting because your other point around disability in history, I mean, one of the things that's jumping to mind. And again, being based in the UK, there are two examples. I mean, Richard III being one, right? There is evidence to suggest that perhaps he did have potentially, a abnormality of his spine, but he's depicted as sort of this hunchback with a withered arm, kind of portrayal. And he is often associated with, you know, evil acts like, killing his nephews or, locking them in the tower. But as you were talking as well, I was thinking about Anne Boleyn. And, Anne Boleyn, one of her charges was witchcraft, and along with many, many others. But what I think is interesting is that what you were saying about the birth and having a child die, that was really heavily used in that time period, at least, around Henry VIII. His first wife wasn't able to give him a son, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, also was unable, but I know that she also had miscarriages or stillbirths, etc. And it was in that time as well viewed as, well, this is God punishing you because of something bad that you're part of or that you've done or you've lied or whatever it might be. So it's so horrific, like you said, to be thinking about all of these things, but it is incredibly important because of the way that you say, with disability and how it's viewed. And we're still seeing incredible misconceptions about disabled people, like all around the world and even in 2025.
Yeah, like I mean this whole narrative of vaccines cause autism, like you'd rather your child die than have autism. That is just a
Right.
horrific take. That is horrible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's so incredibly harmful on so many levels. So I completely agree.
Yeah. So doing disability history, there's often these dark narratives where it's treated so poorly and it's given this negative reasoning of like it is damnation, it is proof that you're a sinner. So I do want to point out a more positive one because there are some.
Go for it.
This is one from the witchcraft trials where Elizabeth Howe was executed for witchcraft. And this is still going to get kind of negative, but her husband was blind. And their daughter's petition for restitution in 1710 saying how Elizabeth would guide him around and that this is part of the world that gets lost is that Elizabeth is executed for witchcraft and that his ability to enter the world is lost. But like we can see that in this marriage between Elizabeth Howe and her husband James, disability is there, it's present in their lives. We don't know why he's blind, we don't know what caused it, and like I think for a long time, like he was blind, so it's not something he was born with, but it's something that happens in his life. There's no record of an accident that I've found that causes it either, so whatever the cause doesn't really matter. Lots of historians will hopefully tell you that like disability history, we don't need to like find the cause of a person's disability and medicalize it. When we look at this moment, though, he lives his life almost entirely as a blind man. Elizabeth guides him throughout his life, and his father testifies in defense of Elizabeth Howe, saying like how great she's been in helping him. So we do see like there are moments where disability is not the sign of sin, and instead it's the sign of how great a wife she's been to him, which does get into some of that gender dynamics of like, okay, the expectations for her are to help her husband, which is very Puritan of them to like expect womanhood to mean this certain thing. But it does mean there is a relationship there where disability is not this negative. It's something that has the two of them together. And when the daughters petition for restitution, they talk about bringing their father twice a week during her imprisonment to go visit her and how expensive that was. They're seeking monetary restitution for it. So there is a family story around disability here that gives some insight to the fact that not all disability in history was seen in a negative way, and not all family stories of disability has this negative background. So maybe that's not the most heartwarming, but it's one of the few we get.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, it's beautifully heartbreaking in a way, but I do agree with you that it is a more positive take on it, and I think that seeking of justice and the father-in-law speaking on her behalf. I'm curious, was she accused of witchcraft because of leading her husband?
It doesn't seem like that. It seems like there
Okay.
was conflict within the church and that her being a church member was a problem for some folks. So it's more personal
Mm,
rivalries there. And that's
okay.
one of the things that like it's an open question for me as to like why his blindness is not brought up in any like significant way other than a defense for her. Because in
Yeah.
most cases it seems like it would have been just given other testimony. So I'm surprised by it. There could be a missing document out there that says something, but it is at least nice to see not all disability was
Mm,
vilified.
yeah.
Like we can, I guess, take what we can get for that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point because yeah, the disability history, I mean, I've done little bits and pieces on that, but it is a overall very dark history. Like you said, this fear and this otherness that we still see, we see in different ways, but I think they're just slightly more covert ways of saying more or less the same thing as what was being said then, which is, disability is more or less purely bad. It's purely tragic for, people who are afflicted by it. It's purely evil and all of that. So it's difficult, I suppose, to reconcile it with the way that I think you and I will think about disability. I mean, like you said, it's people who are in 2025 making the call that being autistic is better than your child contracting whatever, illness or disease that these vaccinations are proven to save you from. Like that judgment call is just wild.
Yeah, and like we see throughout history this eugenics narrative that tends to be where a lot of disability historians have been doing work and like disability rights activism. We're starting to get some of the body history stuff to like not solely be on there because now we have ways to do it and like we've thought through how to integrate disability in history more thoroughly and look for bodily difference. And that's the trick with early America of like there is no idea of the term disability. We're looking for individuals. Now with like digital archives, we're able to search for things more effectively instead of just hoping we come across someone who has a word referencing disability associated with them. So hopefully we can get some better histories out there and find more stuff.
Mm,
Like I feel like I'm often doing piecemeal evidence of, okay, here's a word that means something related to disability because they are referencing a bodily status. And that's the trick. It's just so many little pieces because they aren't documenting it. Like the disability rights movement has been documented as a collective action thing.
mm.
Disability is so individual in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Which is interesting because I've also had a guest on this podcast who is an actor in a period drama. Like he was in Bridgerton, but he's been in other period dramas as well. And he's talked about how disability was probably more prevalent in people than it is now because he was talking about, people who weren't able to receive adequate nutrition, might have had abnormalities or changes or differences because of things like that, or working conditions in factories, or, whatever it is. Like, how does that sort of sit with your understanding of people around that time?
I think so because I think once we start looking, we can find it pretty much everywhere because everything is a relationship with the body, and there is some norm of the body that is put onto people. So we can think
Sure.
about sources and like framing sources as tied to this expectation of bodies. As historians, we're just starting to get into it. So I'm trying to read sources and like figure out where I can bring body history into it. And I'm really excited for like legal history and stuff to start pulling into it just because of how much, like you mentioned earlier, like the idea of temporary insanity. Like there's definitely some continuity here, and like those are going to be documents where we can actually find it and pretty well source things. Whereas personal diaries, personal letters, maybe they don't reference it because a lot of these are written about telling the better things in their lives or like giving good updates. There's also like where do we get the trick of like health history, medical history, and disability history, and like not conflating them but working with them because I do talk about sickness in my work on disability history because it's a curable thing, but so disability was seen as curable through divine providence. So they're kind of the same, but also they're very different,
Mm.
especially looking at them from today.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think it's bizarre that, I mean, the amount of disabled people who would, be like nodding when I say this, but the amount of like people that even in like in my lifetime, in the past 30 whatever years have said, that they'll pray for me. I had one person who actually told me that if I believed in God, I would be able to walk. And I thought, I'm pretty sure it doesn't work like that, but thank you, I guess. Like it's, it was so, yeah, there are so many people who will be able to identify with that.
Yeah, and like that religious narrative is throughout the time period that I look at, where it's like, okay, it's gonna get cured, and it's like all
Mm,
divine providence, and like it's either a curse or a test for you. But if you pass, if you go be a good Puritan, you'll be healed or cured from it. And like that's a trick of studying this language of like we don't buy that for disability today, or we
mm,
shouldn't. How do we talk about disability when like it has that language to it and we don't perpetuate it? Especially where sickness and disease are so prevalent too. Like when they talk about smallpox as an affliction of divine providence, it's the same theology for disability, but I don't want to equate the two and trying to walk those lines to make sure that we're like treating medical history and disability history as distinct but
mm.
overlapping areas is important.
That's fascinating. And I agree, it does sound like a careful line to tread without straying sort of into what could be seen as harmful or, like you say, be out of sync with our understanding of disability today. But if people are interested in this and the work that you do, where would you like people to find you?
Yeah, so I am D Howlett 1692 in most places. DHOWLETT 1692. You can find me on Blue Sky, Reddit under that. I have my website, dhowlett1692.com. I'm everywhere under that handle.
What's next for you in terms of your research? Where are you hoping it's going to go?
I'm working on turning the dissertation on the witchcraft trials into the book version. And this actually was kind of like part one of my prospectus when I proposed the dissertation. I found so much stuff that I had to cut it in half with the chronology I was looking at. Because I initially intended to like go beyond the revolution. So I go into the
Mm.
1730s here. Part two will happen next because there's so much disability history stuff that I was finding that ties together in like what I hope will be a coherent theme across roughly a century. We'll see how it pans out. But the book version will eventually come out. I'm working on the proposal, working on getting a full-time academic job, which would be really nice. We'll see how it goes. Not a
Hey,
great time.
you never know who's listening to this.
Yeah. So if you're looking for an early Americanist or a digital historian or a disability historian, I'm looking for full-time jobs.
I wish you a crazy amount of luck, but I will be your first pre-order for that book because I have just enjoyed this conversation so much. I want to say huge thank you for joining me on this episode and indulging all of my interests in this area, but I think it's such an interesting area of history and within disability that I just was desperate for more people to know about it. So thank you for covering this because it's been a challenge for me to find someone who is sort of an expert in this area and to be able to share this with my lovely listeners. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Wheelchair Activist. If you want to stay up to date and catch all of our previous episodes, you can find them all on my website, thewheelchairactivist.com. You can also follow me on social media at emma.vogelman on most platforms. And if you'd like to support the podcast, our links to the GoFundMe and Buy Me a Coffee are in this episode description. And I'm so excited to bring you another episode next month. See you then.